Welcome to episode 6 of the Curious on Earth podcast. I'm your host Henry Soinoma, and this is my conversation with Neil Woods, who in the 90s started working as an undercover cop in the UK and did pioneering work in infiltrating and busting criminal drug gangs. During his career, he was beaten, almost run over by a car, and threatened with a knife on his groin and a samurai sword on his throat. To advance his goals in this work, he also took advantage of and manipulated vulnerable people, which, in addition to lives destroyed, contributed to him developing complex post-traumatic stress disorder. After years of doing first-class undercover work that put criminals behind bars for a total of more than 1,000 years, Neil slowly started to wonder whether he was really doing any good or actually just causing harm. Slowly, he came to realize that the more innovative and efficient he and his colleagues were, the more brutal the criminal gangs became, thus escalating an endless drug war arms race, which also caused and deepened corruption in our society, but didn't bring us any closer to the stated goals of the drug war. Eventually, the voices haunting him left him with no choice but to quit. He joined the Law Enforcement Action Partnership, an organization for current and former police, judges, and other criminal justice professionals advocating for drug policy and criminal justice reforms, and started speaking out against the drug war and its unspoken human and economic costs, which caused some of his former colleagues to treat him as a traitor. I've had several conversations with Neil before and have throughout the years listened to him speak several times, but I never seem to grow tired of listening to him. He's a brilliant storyteller who paints a very human picture of a man carrying scars of moral injury caused by fighting a futile war with no winners, looking for paths towards redemption. If you appreciate my work, your likes, comments, shares, and subscriptions are helpful and welcome. I also have a Patreon page for those interested in supporting the podcast financially. You'll find the link in the description. I hope you enjoy our conversation. Welcome. Maybe we can start with an introduction. So, who are you and what do you focus on?
My name is Neil Woods, and I'm a former police officer, but now I'm a drug law reform activist. So I'm a full-time activist and writer. I'm part of the Law Enforcement Action Partnership. So I'm on the board for that organisation in the USA and chair of the organisation in Europe. Would you like me to explain what LEAP does?
Sure.
LEAP is an organisation of police and other criminal justice professionals, judges, magistrates, prosecutors, prison staff and prison governors. And we are a rapidly growing movement across the world, and we campaign for an evidence-based drug policy. And to us, the evidence quite clearly points towards the need to legally regulate all drugs. And whereas we work with many allies who concentrate on the need for drug law reform from a human rights perspective or a reducing harm perspective, we agree with all those perspectives, of course, but we very much look at this from a law enforcement perspective. And we realise that drug prohibition has been and is being catastrophic for society.
Mm. How would you describe the process of coming to this conclusion?
Well, I used to work undercover. So I used to catch drug dealers for a living for many years, and I worked undercover over the space of 13 years. I was a police officer for 23 years, but when I started my covert policing, I didn't have the views that I have now, and I was a drug warrior like many of the rest, really believing in what I was doing. And so the process for me, actually, I was quite slow actually in coming to the conclusions, and the reason for that is when you're doing that work, you really do get wrapped up in it, and you do get focused, and you're also you exist in a bubble to a degree as well. You're sort of fired up together with your colleagues to fight the fight that's in front of you, and you're carrying out the law. You're acting on the law, which is of course the police officer's job. And as a result of that, I was very resistant to the rather obvious failings and the obvious problems of the policy. But eventually, even as slow people catch up, and the evidence was irrefutable that what I was doing was not only I was causing harm to individuals during the work that I did, but also I was causing harm to society, because drugs policing only makes society more dangerous.
Maybe we can go to the beginning of what was the process of you deciding to become a cop first?
Well, that's not a typical story for me. I wasn't one of these children that ran around with a plastic police helmet on and drove, played with police cars or anything. It was not on my radar. It was not something that I intended to do at all. But I went to university by mistake. And by mistake, I meant that I picked a really stupid thing to study. And I remember sitting in this lecture theatre thinking, why on earth did I choose to study business studies? I've got absolutely no interest in this at all. And so instead of being sensible at the age of 18, 19 and just finding another course to do, I decided to just drop out completely and find something more interesting to do. So I was going to go on backpacking around Europe, because a friend of mine had done that, and he was having great fun going from fruit picking job to, just traveling. So I was going to do that, but then I saw an advertisement for the police in the local newspaper, and I thought, well, that would also be interesting. Certainly be different every day, and I think that's what I was craving, something different every day. And so I couldn't make my mind up exactly, so I flipped a coin, and the coin came up heads, and that coin flip has taken me on a very convoluted journey, which has ended up me being sat here talking to you in Helsinki. It could have gone another way.
And it also took quite a bit of time to, you could say, find your thing in being a cop, so it didn't feel at all natural at first.
No, I was a terrible police officer. I really just wasn't very good at it. First of all, when I went into the police, and I was 19, and that's really young to be a cop, but I think I was younger than most, and I didn't realise that until I was in the police and I was in this uniform, and I had to deal with conflict, and I just didn't have the tools at all. I was too young, and also I'd been brought up to believe that I could reason with anybody, and I was brought up to value reason, but I was quickly learning that you can't reason with a drunken football hooligan who wants to keep punching you in the face. And that was a hard adjustment for me to make. And so I wasn't very good at it. And it's difficult as a young cop. When you're not very good at it and you develop the reputation of not being very good at it, it's a harsh environment. It really is, because your colleagues need you to back them up. And so, yeah, I really struggled. In the first 2 years, I hated it. And the only reason I didn't leave was just stubborn pride. I wanted to get to the 2 years to be qualified and to know that I'd actually managed to get there. And all the way through that 2 years, I was thinking, I'll get to the 2 years, then I resign. Get to the 2 years, then I'm gone. But I stayed a little bit, and it became a little bit easier. So I ended up staying.
Can you explain a bit the part about, because you mentioned that you have learned that you can talk your way through everything. What were sort of the first or most important experiences of not just getting through situations by just talking, and situations that maybe would have required use of force or projecting authority in a way that was not natural at that point?
Well, I suppose I didn't really tap into my sort of upbringing in terms of reason, trying to just use communication with people until I was working undercover. But I mean, there was many instances where, as a uniform cop, my attempts at reason just didn't work at all. So, for example, I went to a domestic dispute, and it was a guy I already knew because my tutor and I had arrested him for drink driving and I think disqualified driving. We got to this house and he'd assaulted his wife, and then when I was there, he took a knife and cut his wrist, and then said, "You're next." and chased after me. And I remember running around this sofa, and it was house in the living room. There was only a television and one sofa, and the sofa was the only furniture. It was in the middle of this room, and it was quite comic, really, looking back, because I'm running away from him around this sofa, and this guy's bleeding and chasing after me with a craft knife, a Stanley knife,
with the crazy man strategy.
Yeah, you know, looking back, I play it back in my memory, and I've almost got the Keystone Cops theme in my head. It was ludicrous, and I think I'd run twice around the sofa before I remembered that I've got a radio and I can call for backup, which I did, of course. And then I got my staff out, which is just a silly wooden block, But I just kept running. Funnily enough, when you're bleeding, you slow down quicker than someone else. So yeah, that was just one of the bits of rude awakening that humans out there are potentially more mentally ill and more violent than I was prepared for at that point.
So okay, after the 2-year mark, it was a slow process from there too, but you eventually ended up doing undercover work, and you were sort of a vanguard in the UK. So how did that come about?
Well, that happened because I'd got 4 years service in, so this is 1993. And in the UK, there was the mother of all moral panics. And, there's always a moral panic in the press about drugs, isn't there? At the moment, the moral panic in the UK is about nitrous oxide. Everyone's telling horror stories about, whereas actually it's significantly safer than most drugs, and what people need is harm reduction advice, not horror stories. So there's always a moral panic, but the moral panic in 1993 was massive, and it was about crack cocaine, because our tabloid newspapers had been telling the British public literally for years about how crack cocaine was destroying America. And I remember the face of Nancy Reagan, the president's wife, from the 80s, telling everyone that one smoke of crack and you're addicted for life, just like that. And I believed all that rubbish. But so did most of the public. That's the problem. This misinformation was extreme. So the moral panic was so extreme that it would created the classic political feedback loop, where the public had been whipped up into a frenzy of fear, and that fed into politics, where the public was demanding of their politicians, what are you going to do about this? And so the politicians acted tough, like they do. And the Home Secretary instructed all of the chief constables to prioritise drugs above anything, above domestic violence, above whatever. And money poured into the police for that as well. And so that's where I stepped in. The chief constable of Derbyshire, where I was, decided that having young cops with an attachment to the drug squad would share the knowledge and expertise and encourage people to arrest more people for drugs. So that's how I got that attachment. But during that attachment, one of the drug squad cops looked at me strangely and said, "Do you fancy having a go at buying some crack?" I thought, well, that's not a suggestion I was expecting at all, but I'll have a go at anything. And so it was that within just 3 weeks of that attachment, I was being given £20 and told to go and knock on this door and ask this guy for some crack cocaine. And an obs point was hastily set up, and I remember knocking on the door, and this huge guy answered, and he said, "Yeah, what do you want? Who are you? You're not a student, are you? I fucking hate students." And then at that moment I thought, actually, I don't know who I am. I hadn't thought that much ahead. No one told me I had to have a cover story, but I thought that'll do.
And no one really had thought about
you
needing one.
No, just go knock on that door. It seems obvious now, doesn't it? But there wasn't that much prep, and I hadn't thought about it adequately. Anyway, I thought that'll do. Yeah, I'm a student. And he says, "Are you stupid? I've just told you I fucking hate students." Anyway, he seemed to find it funny, and he agreed to sell me a little stone of crack cocaine. I paid him my 20 quid. And as I'm turning away, he says, "You take care now. Don't get yourself arrested," which I thought was quite considerate, really, quite nice. But I went back to the drug squad holding my little paper twist of crack and said, "I've got it." And that then dictated the next, 13, 14 years of my career and beyond, really, because I did the training as well. Or rather, after I finished undercover work, I did the training while I was doing the undercover work. But the point of that day really is that it was really easy, because that kind of undercover work just hadn't been happening in the UK at all. I'm not saying I invented undercover work, far from it. There was high-end undercover work where, at the highest level, where people would infiltrate the higher echelons of organised crime. But that kind of undercover work starting at the bottom, that hadn't happened in the UK at all before, and still doesn't happen in many countries, actually. But of course, the drug squad saw easy results in that. And so I was quickly doing jobs which lasted a few days, then a few weeks, and then in no time at all, it was no less than 6 or 7 months at a time. And I was being loaned out to drug squads and covert units all over England, really. As far north as Leeds, as far south as Brighton.
You mentioned it wasn't done in the UK, so for example, it was done in the States already, like decades ago? Or?
Yeah, that kind of undercover work had happened in the United States, actually, since the 1980s, early 1980s at least. And in fact, if you look at the writings of Mr. Serpico, I think he was in the 1970s, actually.
Why do you reckon that didn't spread to the UK? Was it because it was a different kind of drug culture?
I think because the United States was so much further ahead in the war on drugs. I mean, they criminalised heroin in 1914, and as a result of that, they'd seen the development of organised crime. Organised crime literally was birthed by drug prohibition, and they'd seen the effect of it, and they'd had many, many decades of the associated problems. So, hundreds of thousands of people with problematic heroin addiction in New York alone. It was huge. But in the UK, of course, we hadn't had that. In the 1970s, we were absolutely new to all this. The British system, up until the end of the 1960s, meant that if you had a problem with heroin or cocaine, you went to a doctor and got help. Fairly straightforward system, really.
Mm-hmm.
But that help meant that you would get a prescription. So you had a safe and clean supply. As a result of that, at the end of the British system, we only had 1,046 heroin consumers in the UK. From the moment it was banned, from international pressure from the United States, from the moment it was banned, and that obviously the market was handed to organised crime, in less than 15 years, we had 300,000 problematic heroin consumers. So we didn't have the long-term societal problems created by drug policy at that point. So by the 1990s, we were really catching up with how aggressive we can police this problem.
It makes me think like I'm trying to get into the head of the people who proposed to you going undercover, that did it not occur to them to find out whether, for example, cops in the US had learned something about their experiences of doing that before just pushing someone?
It was done. Yeah, it was done on the fly, really, and it was all very reactive as well, because whereas the drug squad were all very highly qualified people in terms of surveillance, all the covert policing, they were all highly qualified detectives before they went in. There was still a sort of flying by the seat of your pants sort of approach, a real adaptive approach, and they were suddenly under a lot of pressure as well, because this shift of policy from the Home Office, it was quite dramatic. It was a clear instruction, and chief constables were expected to get results, so they were really under pressure.
So there's also the feeling that we have to put out the message outside, or the impression that we are doing something before that, and that we can figure it out as we go, or something like that.
Yeah, and also it was at that time, right up until actually the early 2000s, really. Numbers were the measure. numbers of arrests, numbers of seizures, was always the measure, as is the curse of many police, most police probably around the world actually. Numerical measures are not good for society, but that was the measures that were the pressure.
Yeah, so they are sort of like just looked at without any context of what does this actually mean? What do these numbers mean?
Exactly, yeah. Numbers are, just higher numbers are good.
Before we go into the practical experience of starting to do the undercover work, you also mentioned that the bottom-up style wasn't done before, but could you maybe distinguish? So there are there like two main approaches of doing undercover work? And
yeah, I mean the traditional professional approach of undercover work in the UK and many European countries is what we describe in what we call in the UK level 1 undercover work. And level 1 is where somebody might spend years building a legend, a background, and it's very high level, and they would infiltrate higher echelons of something. And part of that high level undercover work in the UK actually was also a separate branch to the criminal investigation, but we also have had political infiltration as well, but run by a special branch, which has created its own scandals in the UK about the spy cops scandal, where long-term undercover operatives were infiltrating predominantly left-wing political organisations like anti-racist campaigns, CND, Greenpeace even, and having relationships with women and even having children with them, which is incredible, really. When it still doesn't stop shocking me that there isn't more outrage about it. It is a scandal that goes on in the UK, and there is an inquiry going on, but we need more outrage about that, I think. But that's the same level as some of the organised crime infiltration that's done by traditional undercover work.
And so basically, it's so that they are making themselves out to be big players and trying to infiltrate through that.
Yes, that's essentially it. It's further up. Whereas the kind of work that I did started off with a simple outlook. You buy drugs, you get the evidence, you bust the dealer. But of course, it quickly became much more difficult because suddenly they knew that the cops had a new tactic, which meant that the infiltration and the amount of time and development I'd have to put into it was constantly increasing, and it became much more sophisticated undercover work, where you would have to, be accepted into communities and, develop friendships and, put some real time into it.
So maybe you can go into the everyday experience of that.
Yeah, certainly. In what regards? You mean
like
in terms of procedural or?
Well, you can start with that, yeah.
Well, this is an interesting thing about how the procedures developed, because obviously the first 4 years I had no training. So I was literally just making it up as I went along, and I made plenty of mistakes as well. But we learned from those mistakes, and then other people were doing it as well. I helped develop the training after 4 years, but within a few years, it became very clear to those people who were running these things that systems needed to be put in place, and so there came into shape regional covert operational hubs, and I ended up working for one of those called the East Midlands Special Operations Unit, which incorporated quite a large geographical area. And the systems that were put in place were that EMSU, the organisation I worked for, would loan me out to a constabulary. But before we did that, the constabulary would have to have systems in place. So the team would have to be completely separate from normal policing. And each one of those cops would not be allowed to communicate with their colleagues during the period of time. So it was completely separate, not in a police station, in a separate secret location, the safe location as we called it. You would have to have someone doing backup, someone doing the role of intelligence officer who could both filter intelligence into the operation and also collate the intelligence that was coming in. You would have a tech officer who would be responsible for all of the exhibits and technical equipment and that kind of thing. So you'd have this tight team. And before I got to that team, they would all be sat down and briefed the day before, and they would be given what's called a lawful order. And a lawful order is a big deal. It means you're in trouble if you break this order. You will be disciplined. You could be sacked even. And the lawful order was that they must not ask me my real name. And they must not ask me where I'm from. So I was using the same pseudonym to the cops I was working with, to the people on the streets and the gangsters when I eventually got to meet them. Now, the reason I tell you this, because it's actually very important, those systems and the existence of those systems is, for one reason, is because of corruption. The existence of all of those systems, the separation from normal policing, the instruction that they can't ask me my real name, all of those things, there are all systems for each operation put in because of the real threat of corruption and the threat to my life as a result of it. Now, the evidence for that is that you don't have those systems for any other kind of investigation. It's only for drugs. It's only for drugs. And that's important for people to take note. So those systems, they indicate a very serious problem that the police, covert police, know about and understand. But I think it's important for the public to understand that those systems are in place and why.
What does this imply? Why is it so important? And what kind of understanding emerges once you start realizing that exists?
Well, it's important to note that those safeguards are not necessary for anything else, only for investigating drugs. And those safeguards are only put in place once you accept that there is endemic corruption, that there is a risk of corruption. And each one of those cops were picked very, very carefully and background checks and really studied for who was going to be on those teams, again, to protect me. So the implication for that is that policing is corrupted and that these safeguards are necessary, which means, and all the other safeguards don't work, that corruption is endemic. There's no other conclusion you can come to from that. Otherwise, the systems wouldn't be there. But again, you see, if the public knew that, then it would influence public opinion very much, I think.
I think we'll go also into some examples of what corruption means on a practical level. But first, let's delve deeper into your experiences as you start doing the undercover work. So quite quickly you realize that it's going to be changing all the time, that the criminal, both the criminal individuals and the criminal organizations are going to be adapting into your methods or to your methods, and also it becomes evident or obvious that it's much more dangerous than you initially might have thought. So can you share stories about this so people can get a grasp of what it's like?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose the first time I thought I was going to die, that would be in the city of Stoke-on-Trent, and I think it's a good example that because I've been doing it for a few years, and the first time I met that guy in Derby, there was no real threat of violence, and I think it's important to point out that violence increased on the streets, not just for me, or rather the threat of violence, not just for me, but for everyone else as well. It was my presence on those streets which heated up the market. And so an example of that is a guy I'd been buying weights of heroin from, actually. I'd worked up the ladder a little bit to get to him, and I'd been buying weights off him rather than just sort of 10 bags and things. And I knocked on his door one day, and he answered the door and put a samurai sword to my throat, which was quite surprising to say the least. But not only did he put that to my throat, but then he was screaming at me. He says, "You're fucking drug squad. You're fucking DS. I know you are." And his face was going blood red. He was really angry, and the saliva was flying out of his mouth. I was getting hit with his spit, and I thought, this is it. I can feel that cold steel against my throat, and I'm going to die. And then I heard a woman laughing. And this woman sort of leaned out from around him and said, "I thought he was going to say he was then." And he was laughing, and then they were both laughing together. So he didn't mean it. Perhaps he just wanted to try out his new sword. I don't know. But it was humour to him, but it was also a serious amount of intimidation. And, a situation had come about where dealers are very aware of their reputation and the importance of it. And of course, every dealer doesn't want to get grassed up. So if you can be the scariest dealer, you don't get grassed up. So I think that was the first time I thought I might die.
Do you think it was purely a joke for him, that there was no serious part of him thinking that you are undercover?
I don't think so, because I don't think he would have been so quick to humour. However, if I had reacted in a way that had made him suspicious, I do not doubt that my life was in danger at all, because he was a very chaotic individual, actually. Very unpredictable.
So this also connects to the part of the work that you've said that you cannot really play a role, that you have to be, in a sense, yourself, but you just have to exaggerate some parts of you. So talk a bit about that.
Yeah, it's hard to describe how you have to approach undercover work, but how it develops in terms of the dialogue around training, when we're trying to explain it to prospective undercover cops, was that you can't be an actor. We're not an actor, because actors have particular skills. They go to drama school and they pretend to be someone completely different, and they do that either for a few minutes scene filming or for a couple of hours play on the stage, and they are highly skilled at it. And undercover cops are not highly skilled actors. They're not, and we should never try and be. Because if you try and act to be a different person, you will get found out, because we're not doing a scene for 10 minutes for a film, and we're not doing a play for 2 hours. We might be with these people for days, and you can't maintain an act like that. You can't. So you have to be a different version of yourself. And that is a difference to acting. So you have to, at your core, still be who you are, but sort of adapt shades of yourself to the situation or role that you're in, really. Because the least, I was a good liar, and that's one of the reasons that I was good at it. And I used to love, certainly in the early days, I used to love the intellectual exercise of lying. I did. I enjoyed manipulating people around me. I enjoyed, the challenge of it. But of course, you have to acknowledge when you're taking on that level of lying that minimal tweaks are easier to maintain, and the smaller amounts of information that you're relying on makes your lying easier.
When you practice lying and manipulation as a part of your job, does it start to reflect on your your personal life also?
It didn't for me. I mean, I know that I've spoken to others and it seemed to for them, but I managed to separate my home life and undercover work very, very well, actually. And even when I was working away some distance, so I would have to be living on plot or living nearby for 3 or 4 days, I would still manage to build into my cover story that I needed to be away and more often than not get home and to take my kids swimming on a Sunday morning. So I would still have those sort of serene family moments and then back to buying drugs from gangsters on the Monday. It was a peculiar thing, but it didn't really impact on my behavior. Although I suspect that the constant practice of lying probably held me back in my obvious ethical conclusions. It probably one of the things that made me more resistant to changing my mind and making me realize that the harm that I was causing. Because if you're wrapped up in something which is essentially unethical, because I'm emotionally manipulating people around me and actually being indulgent in the art of lying, that has to have some kind of drag on one's ethical thinking. I would think.
One aspect of that work that's also quite difficult to imagine for someone who has never done that sort of work is that you can tell no one about anything that you're doing. How does that work in practice?
Well, I mean, I was told right away, once we started doing jobs more than a few days, I was told right away, you cannot tell anybody like this about this. You just can't. You can't trust anybody because it's interesting for people. It's gossip for people. You can't even tell your family. You can't tell anybody this. And you certainly can't tell your colleagues. So it became quite a lonely place when I was working for these covert teams, and I was sort of cocooned from them, and they were cocooned from normal policing anyway. It became very isolated. And of course, in all of the increasing stressful situations that I found myself in, there's really no one to talk to about it. Now, I'm not saying that I felt the need to unload and talk to people about it at the time. That's not really true. I'm an introvert, and I'm quite happy with my own company and thinking, and I'll relax and read a book. So I find it easy to. I used to find it easy to unwind in that way, but I think I would probably have suffered less from the decline of my mental health if I had been at the time responding to those stresses and talking them through with people. I mean, theoretically, I had my cover officer always. A cover officer in those situations is like my advocate to the team and to the investigating pressure, and the sort of buffer zone between myself and the investigators. The theory is, of course, that the cover officer protects me from the investigative vigor of those that want to achieve a lot, but it didn't always work, because quite often they were allied with the investigators more than me. But even so, even when I did get on with my cover officer, I still didn't naturally talk to them about anything, because it's a very macho environment as well, very macho. I developed this reputation very quickly of somebody who could cope with extreme threats of violence and brush it off. And to a degree, that was true. I went through these things, and I'd go back to the team, and I'd explain, this guy had a samurai sword. And the samurai sword incident, for example, it didn't end there, because as soon as I walked away from that and I put four wraps of heroin in a cigarette packet, as I did that, I looked up, and there's a guy with a knife pointing into my stomach. So talk about frying pan and fire. It was ridiculous. And it's this guy basically just trying to rob me for the heroin I'd just bought. And I thought, oh no, I've just gone through way too much for this heroin. There's no way you're having it, mate. So I just started going backwards really quickly, and I turned and ran. And as I was starting to run away, he said to me, no, hang on a minute, just come here a minute. And I thought, no, I'm not coming here at all. Anyway, then I was running around a car, and it was a bit like the sofa, actually. Running around the car, like you used to as a kid when chasing each other. But then I ran away, and I got away with them easily enough. But when I went back to the team and I described all this, and I described it, like a matter of fact kind of way, they were all like, wow, you're some kind of weirdo. You're not shaking, you're just describing these events. And so I developed this reputation of having this cool head and being able to cope with these things. And of course, I was a young man. I love that reputation. That's a great reputation to have, isn't it? And, it boosted my ego massively. And it was almost like I bought into my own legend a little bit, which meant that I always took the risks. And because I took the risks, I continued to develop a reputation. And then I got the more dangerous operations, and it snowballed, really. But the point is that no one told me during all of those experiences that it was potentially causing me mental health damage. No one mentioned that. And it was a macho environment in which at the time I thrived.
So I've been thinking about, like, because you talk, for example, in your book, you talk about your family life at that time. And I've been wondering about, are you able at that point to tell your wife that you're doing something that you can tell her nothing about, or do you have to invent a story for her also about, so yeah.
I told her I was doing covert work and couldn't really talk about it.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't tell her what I was doing. And the problem is, as time went on as well, it's not in the book because they wouldn't let me put it in the book, but I was also in an abusive relationship. She was abusive to me. Now, I should acknowledge that the vast majority of domestic violence and domestic abuse is directed towards women, but there are those of us, men as well, who also suffer that. So I was in a peculiar situation by around 2003 that at times it was more relaxing for me to go off and buy crack cocaine from gangsters than it was to be at home. So we didn't necessarily communicate so well. And it's been suggested to me in some interviews actually that, well, did my undercover work contribute to that problem in my marriage? And maybe it did. Maybe that lying did. Maybe the lack of openness was a trigger for her feelings. I don't know. It's difficult to unpick really, because from my point of view, she was abusive and I struggled to cope with it for the sake of looking after my kids. So these things can be complicated, can't they?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I imagine one of the most hardest thing about keeping secrets is that you feel that you're keeping them to protect other people, or that you have a really good reason to keep them.
Yeah, exactly. When I was at home, I was always just, wanted to protect my kids from the way that she was treating me. But I was confident that there was family around looking after the kids when I wasn't there. So actually, quite often, I concluded that actually having those breaks away from home was actually quite helpful because she didn't have the same friction with anyone else. So yeah, it was complicated.
Eventually, when you came out in public and started criticizing the enforcement of the drug war, if you can talk about this, how did your family members react at the point when you started talking about your past?
Yeah, well, I'd split up from my wife by then, by about 3 years at least, I think, and I'd had quite a mental health breakdown as well, leading up to the end of my career, and it took me a while to build up the mental strength to actually go public and do something. So in that time when I was ill, I had been telling my immediate family, what I'd been up to, what was behind some of my problems. So they weren't completely shocked. But I think when the book came out, there was a lot more in there that any of them knew about. Really, it was a difficult process to actually get all of that information out, to be honest, and it's a tribute to my good friend J.S. Raffaeli that he got it out of me in such detail, because it can't have been that easy for him, really.
Yeah, it's a really amazing, well-written book. You have 2 books out, but I've read like 90% of the first one, and yeah, really, really engaging. Even after, because I've listened to hours and hours of your talks, and we've talked before, but still, like even the stories that I've heard before are really engaging to read. So
yeah, well, I mean, that's the skill of JS. I think the biggest skill of JS is that he knew what to leave out and to keep things very minimal, because there's a load of stuff that other stories, but he trimmed it down, and that's the writer's skill, isn't it? To know what to leave out.
Well, okay. Regarding the amazing human experiences that you've encountered during the undercover work, maybe you can share a couple of more of those that you also write about in the book. For example, the time when you were forced to strip naked because you were being suspected of being wired.
Yeah. Well, that was the Burger Bar Boys, and that was very, very late on. I think it's probably 2004. Now, I'll have to set the scene with the Burger Bar Boys, because I'd actually given up undercover work. I'd found it too emotionally difficult, and I told the MSU that I had stopped. But they tried to get operatives into this gang, the Burger Bar Boys, and people tell me it's a very British name for a gang. That people say it could only be in the UK. But despite the very comic book name, they were really, really brutal gang, very dangerous gang, and MSU had tried to get operatives close to them and failed. So they approached me and said, "Look, Woodsy, we need you to come back, and we need you to do this job, because this gang is even worse than the last one that you had dealings with." And I was shown the intelligence of them, and they were doing gang rapes as part of their reputation building. They were doing the normal kind of gangster stuff like kidnappings and maimings and murders, but they were also using sexual violence as part of their reputation. One of them, the 6 gang members that I was particularly looking at, one of them was implicated in 7 different murders. And also he's meant to have been the person who supplied the machine guns for 2 very infamous murders in the UK a few months before that, the murders of 2 young women, Letitia Shakespeare and Charmaine Harris. So I knew the caliber of these people. And when I was introduced to them, actually, do you want me to tell you when I was introduced to them? When I was introduced to them, eventually I manipulated some vulnerable people into introducing me further up, and I met them directly. And I went into this toilets of this snooker club in the town of Northampton. And one of them came in with a hood up and went into the toilet cubicle, stood on the toilet and looked over the top and said, "What's this?" And
briefly, I've heard you tell this story a couple of times. But I never understood what was he doing when he said, "What's this?"
So he went into the toilet cubicle. He stood on the toilet. He shut the door, and then he held onto the door and looked over like that. So he's looking at me from being stood on the toilet and leaning onto the door.
So you're outside the cubicle.
So I'm outside the cubicle, stood in the space, with the urinals nearby, and looking up at him basically.
And he's just playing a bit of crazy.
Yeah.
Okay,
just being higher up than me. But it was all very choreographed, because the moment he said, "All right, what's this?" then the door burst open again, and 4 more hooded figures came in, and they started walking around me slowly. And so he was asking me questions, and he was asking my companion questions and rephrasing the questions. And all the time, these hooded figures are walking around me. And then every so often, one of them would headbutt me on the ear. Now, I believe it's a headbutt. I always say it's a headbutt. But it's trying to visualize it. It's just, I can't imagine what else would have hurt so much, And then one of them would jostle me. Another one would punch me in the ribs. So it was like violence, just increasing violence all of the time. And, I knew the reputation of these people. So I was coming to the conclusion I wasn't going to get out of there in one piece. And then as I was coming to that conclusion, he said, "All right, what do you want?" And I said, very politely, "I'll have 1 and 1, please," which means a 0.4 of heroin and a 0.4 of crack, 0.4 of a gram. And so I gave him my £40, took the drugs. And I was in then, and we exchanged numbers, and I started gathering evidence of conspiracy against that whole gang. And a few months later, and it was months, it was a long time, I'd started to wear a camera. Now, you don't wear a camera at the start, because that would be stupid, because you are likely to be searched. But after you think, well, they trust me enough now, I'd started to wear a camera. And then one day, I thought, I don't like the way they're looking at me today. And this sort of suspicion kept with me. So the next morning, when I was coming to the decision to put the camera on, I thought, I'm not going to do that. And I told the team, I said, "I'm not wearing the camera today. I got a funny feeling about the team." And they were so, okay. And I'm very glad I took that decision, because when I saw them, there was 4 of them, I believe. Although this is something sketchy in my brain. I believe it was at least 4 of them. And they put me through these sliding doors into this vehicle. And I was taken, and it wasn't that secluded, really. There's a centre of the town of Northampton called the Racecourse. And again, I'm not entirely sure exactly where it was, but I know it was near to the racecourse. It was under some trees. And they took me to this spot, and they said, "Right, strip. You're 5-0, man. You're fucking heat. I know you are. Strip. You're wearing a wire."
So 5-0 is?
5-0 is, it's slang for police. And the slang originates from the 1970s program, Hawaii 5-0. And actually, I remember looking at this guy saying, "You're 5-0. And I remember thinking, you're not old enough to have seen Hawaii 5-0. But it's weird what goes through your head. Or it's weird what goes through my head anyway, at situations like that. And I'm thinking, no, I'm not going to do that. And then one of them lifted his T-shirt up and showed me a gun, like a self-loading pistol, tucked into his tracksuit bottoms. And again, the weirdest things go through my head at times of adrenaline like that, because I remember looking at that gun thinking, how on earth is the elastic in those tracksuit bottoms keeping that gun up? But that's what went through my head. But of course, then I realised, I'm doing as I'm told here, aren't I? I'm doing as I'm told. So I did as I was told, and they stripped me and they humiliated me, and it wasn't very good at all. But I do remember the smug feeling, thinking I left the wire off, I left the camera off, which was actually a pretty high tech camera for that job. It was one of the few jobs where it was high tech, but even so, you found it. It was a little box. Really little box and a very thin wire. With the camera, you can't even tell it's a camera, but it still wouldn't have been much doubt. So yeah, I was very pleased I hadn't worn that. But then I was in an interesting situation. I don't often talk about this, but I've just done. A few weeks ago, I did a talk at the University of Law in London, and the guy who asked me to do that was the guy who was in charge of that operation. Who's now a lecturer at that University of Law, which was really interesting because I hadn't seen him since that event. I had no idea of his views on drug policy or anything. So it was like, wow, I didn't think he'd be on my side, but he at least is. But he is at least partially on our side. You know, he's a supporter of what I've been doing. And of course, I had to say to him, why did I not tell him that? Why did I not come back and say, this has just happened? Because I didn't tell anyone. I didn't put that in my evidence. And I says, well, if I'd done that, what would you have done? And he says, it would have gone upstairs, meaning he would have reported it up. And I says, and then what would have happened? Well, the job would have been shut down, like that. We hadn't got all the evidence.
So here, as with J.S. Raffaelli, having to decide what to leave out, you also have to be sort of writing a story as you're doing the undercover work. You have to decide what to put in and what to leave out in order to achieve your goals.
Yeah, exactly. And it's not the first time I've done that. I've done that a few times. And I know other undercover cops who've taken a similar view, because from my point of view, I'd learned to hate these fuckers. I really had. And I wanted to catch them, and I wanted to get this job done right. And it was already seriously hard work and unpleasant. I wasn't walking away from it. And if I'd reported on that, the job would have ended. And the chances are that there's no way you would have found them still carrying the gun, because they were very careful people that had used that. Then that would have been stashed. There's no way we would have found it. So I took the decision that, and I knew my boss would have just reported it. It would have followed procedure perfectly. I knew that. So it was an interesting day of thinking and, dealing with it, really. Yeah. And especially as I'm pretty sure I did 2 buys as well that day before I went back to the team. Yeah.
You also in the book you write about how some of your colleagues advise you to leave something out in your reports, and the way they phrase it makes it obvious that that's just convention, that's how it's done, that it's obvious that you don't write everything. And for example, regarding someone carrying a gun in a different situation, I recall something like that.
Yeah, I mean, I learned that from someone else, and it was actually a member of the Derby drug squad back in probably, well, it was 10 years before the Burger Bar Boys job. 10 years before the first cop told me, and it was before we used purpose-built notebooks. I was just writing a normal statement, and I was telling him, and he was the person I'd debriefed with. The others weren't there yet. And he says, yeah, you could write that, because basically I bought crack off this guy who was a henchman of a dealer called Bigger Williams in Derby. I can't remember the name. And actually, do I use his real name in the book anyway? Anyway, I bought crack off this henchman, and he told me to drop the money in his lap. And I leaned in, and when I dropped the money, I saw a self-loading pistol leaning against his ankle in the bottom of the car, leaning against his leg, his ankle. And of course, I'm thinking, I have to write that up. Didn't expect that.
And the guy wants you to see the gun.
I think he must have done. He must have done. I mean, it's a pretty stupid place to hide it, if not. But the drug squad detective, who I can see his face right now, he said, "Well, yeah, you could write that, or you could maybe not put that in because we haven't got enough evidence against these yet. And do you reckon we'd find that gun if we'd pulled them now?" Don't know. Probably not. So he said, "Yeah, well, leave it out, and then we'll gather in the next few weeks. We'll gather enough evidence against them to put them away." Okay, so that's how it's done, is it? Okay, so that's what happened a few times for me.
Well, regarding these encounters, dangerous encounters, there was also the story of the knife in the groin.
Oh God, yeah.
Must be pleasant recounting this again and again.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. These incidents aren't actually the things that they seem to have been key traumatic incidents from PTSD. I don't think so, anyway, because I can recount them, and it's not. None of these things are triggers for me. The triggers are much more complicated. But yeah, it was a job for Nottinghamshire. I mean Nottingham, and there was a lot of pressure for this operation because at the time there was lots of shootings going on, lots and lots of them. There was a open war between a gang called the Bestwood Cartel, headed by a gangster called Colin Gunn, and everybody else, essentially everyone. And there were shootings every day, so there was lots of pressure to find out about the violence. And I got introduced to this gangster type who was theoretically a minor lieutenant of Colin Gunn. He was part of that gang. And apparently, I'd been told this on intelligence the day before, that he'd been upsetting the leadership of his gang. And he'd actually, the day before I met him, had been taken into a field, stripped naked, and had a shotgun put into his mouth. And the reason for that is because they'd upset him because he was kept casually using a knife. So, violent gangster got upset with one of his team for being violent, essentially, and stripped him naked, should have put a shotgun in his mouth. So I knew this intelligence. And then I got introduced to him. And he turned up in this car. And it was really peculiar because this guy had his 12-year-old son with him in the front passenger seat of the car. And his 12-year-old son was wearing exactly what he was wearing. They were wearing identical two-piece tracksuits, identical trainers, identical gold chain round the neck, and identical shaved head. It was like he'd got his mini-me. It was so odd. And clearly, his swagger, he was showing his son the ropes, He was showing off to his son. So God knows where he is now, that 12-year-old, what's ended up, how he's ended up, in dead or prison, probably. But it was a bizarre situation because then he opened the car door and he held a knife to my groin and pushed it into my groin, and I felt a cold blade where you don't ever want to feel a cold blade. It was really, really quite uncomfortable and off-putting to the conversation, to say the least. But eventually, I mean, it felt like it went on forever. It was probably just a few minutes. I answered his questions, and he sold to me. Now, interestingly, on that operation, I was working I wasn't working on my own. I was working as part of a team. But because we always took a rule that because someone has a reputation of being aggressive and potentially violent, a violent situation is easier to manage if it's one-on-one. It's one of the basic rules of communication. It's the same for hostage negotiation, for example. A hostage negotiator in the police is always one designated person, one point of communication. In an interview, you might have two detectives, but you don't talk at once. You see on TV and they take the alternate questions. No, you don't do that. One person is always in control of the communication, and the other detective doesn't speak unless it's handed over to them, and then they know they've got control. So it's very important. Communication works best one-on-one. So in a threatening situation, we would routinely say, "I'll take this on my own." It's safe. It's better that way. There's no misunderstandings. I can manage what's said, So I've just thought about this recently, actually, because again, talking about this, that if we decided to go as a pair, that probably wouldn't have happened because she was a woman, and I don't think he would have done that in the same way. I don't think so, anyway. But you don't know how he would have threatened her, so hindsight, hey.
Talk a bit about your relationship with mortality, because you've had quite some brushes with mortality in your work.
God, I have had many brushes with mortality. I've been chased with a car and almost run over with a car.
I want to hear that story later, but go on here.
There was, and there's many times, but I suppose, I mean, a lot of the instances which trigger me for PTSD come from not actually the moments where it's been very obvious I'm in danger. It's been from the more ambiguous moments. So the Burger Bar Boys, I think I was already suffering from the beginnings of PTSD before I started that job. I don't, looking back, I realized because it was all much more difficult. And later on the job, I remember making an arrangement to meet them, and they could be really moody. They could be really just quick to anger. And on the phone, they were mumbling something like "Lear," and I couldn't work out what they were saying. And eventually, after he was shouting at me, screaming at me, saying the ark, you better fucking be there in 15 minutes. And then I thought, I know what he means. It's a car wash called the Ark. So I had to go there. And as I'm waiting, thinking he's really angry, and my fight or flight is firing up. My brain is saying, you need to run away from this. You're in danger. But my intellectual self is thinking, well, no, I've got a job to do. I've got to stay here. So staying there and making the decision to stay there, even though every fibre of my being is saying, you're in danger again. This time they're going to kill you. But it's quite a thing to face, to just force oneself to be calm and wait when you feel in genuine danger of being killed. And it's almost like a weird meditative state, putting those fears to one side. But those kind of events actually cause me more trauma, more damage, I think, than the actual instances where the threat was more immediate. Because that triggered that, unpicking that memory, and that memory was buried until 2018, because I realised that I took the car for a car wash, and I was hyperventilating and get hypervigilant in a car wash. And I'm thinking, hang on, there's nothing threatening in this car wash. It's just a car wash. But I was freaking out, and it developed so I avoided even driving the road past it. I'd drive right out of my way so I wasn't driving past the car wash. So I'm thinking, what's going on here? And eventually I remembered this memory of having to force myself to wait. And the thing is, he turned up and he was in a good mood by the time he got there. So all that fear and that sense of immediate potential death was wasted. I developed a sort of interesting relationship with the idea of mortality because I think I was already suffering from the trauma at that point. Things were becoming much more difficult. I was becoming much more aware of the imminent possibility of being murdered. Is that what you meant?
Though I'm also interested in where you stand now in relation to your mortality, because you're not like every day facing those sorts of situations, I imagine.
Well, my fears from my mental health condition, from my chronic PTSD, are I don't feel in my everyday life more at risk, because the medical impact of my PTSD is actually, it's irrational. It's irrational fears. And it's peculiar because I know they're irrational, but I'm still suffering from them. So, for example, when COVID hit, a lot of my talks that I've been booked for, everything went online, and lots of people suffer from this. But I started doing some online speaking events with like I don't know, a student like a criminology course I'd been booked to speak to or something like that. And so I had this audience online, and I'm staring at my iPad, and I can't see the audience. And my pulse went up. I'm starting to drip cold sweat. And at the end, I was wet in sweat, just looking over my shoulder, thinking I'm going to be attacked. I'm in my living room. There's no one in the house with me. I'm not in danger. And that took some real working out as to why that was happening. And the reason is I couldn't see the body language of the audience. Can't see their body language. Whereas, I've spoken in front of an audience of 2,000. That didn't even make my pulse raise. I'm perfectly relaxed when I'm speaking. But that's because I can see them all. I can see their body language. And unconsciously, I know they're not a threat. But unconsciously, all the way through the tube and into the internet, I can't see their body language. So part of me is saying they're a threat. They're a threat. So my sense of mortality, that's not rational. And even experiencing it as a physiological impact, I'm quite aware it's not rational. That doesn't mean I can stop it, because that's the nature of mental illness. It's not rational, is it? So I don't feel extra fear of mortality in my everyday goings on. It's just when PTSD comes and bites me in the arse like that I suffer some horrendous anxiety, really brain-gnawing anxiety.
In relation to your ability to cope in situations where many people could not cope, you've also talked about the effect of adrenaline on you. That's not maybe the regular reaction.
Yeah, the reasons why I was good at undercover work. Partly just the way my brain works in terms of enjoying the challenge and things. But the point is, when I had points in time when I was at risk and I had those big adrenaline surges, and I know that there are other people experience this the same way, because I've had this discussion with people, but it's a minority of people who have this reaction. When I had a big surge of adrenaline, I had the sensation that time was completely slowing down, that I had all the time in the world to think my way through it. Obviously, this was my brain speeding up in response, the fight or flight, thinking the best way to survive. But it was quite a heady experience. And so, I really did feel like I just had all the time to think my way through. And it gave me a lot of confidence that I could think my way through and escape any situation. A useful physiological response, I think, at the time.
I'm thinking about, is that actually the same thing that happens with, for example, firemen in difficult situations?
Yeah, quite possibly. I know I'm not alone in this. Other people do have this. I've discussed it with some people, and they say no, they don't have that. But what they do is, with an adrenaline response, they very quickly remember all of their training. They go into a mode where they remember every rote, every bit of their systems, their reactions. And military people I've spoken to say that that suddenly their training makes sense because they remember it all, and that's what happens with their adrenaline. But for me, I wasn't relying on training. I was relying on my wits, and so my adrenaline response was more about sort of supercharging my thinking processes.
Mm-hmm. This also, I think, connects to what you've talked about, the role of instinct. And you referred before to the occasion where you were almost run over by a car. So
yeah,
and instinct played a major role in you surviving that situation.
Yeah, I think it did. It was definitely instinctive. That one was it was a gangster who I'd met months before. But he was quite a big player, so it was quite accidental that I'd managed to buy off him directly, and a bit weird. I tried to get him to come out again because when I'd bought off him early in the operation, I wasn't wearing a camera, didn't have any corroborative evidence, so we needed corroborative evidence. So he wasn't coming out to sell me any drugs. So what I did is, because I knew he was into his clothes, he was quite a snappy dresser. I got hold of some counterfeit Stone Island jackets and put a phone call into him saying I'd got these to sell if he wanted to come and buy any from me. And that's what brought him out. But the trouble is he brought 2 of his mates with him who I'd not met before. And I met in this it was very secluded car park. I say secluded, but it was still actually close to the city centre of Leicester. And he turned up and I'd showing him these jackets, and one of them was trying to try them on. And the guy that I knew said, well, you just want to sell me these, or do you want to buy something? I says, well, if you carry in white, I'll have a 20 stone from you. And so he gets this big block of crack out. And are you old enough to remember VHS videos? It was like that size, a big block of crack. And he sat in his car and started to unwrap it to cut me a piece. But then as he did that, his mate suddenly starts looking at me and he says, how long have you known him? I've not seen you before. I says, I've known him months. I said, I've known you months, haven't I? And then he pushed me up against this like security fence, which is sort of galvanized steel bent with this points on the top, big security fence. And he pushed me up against that and started searching my clothes. And this is 2001. This is quite early on. And I was wearing a camera, but it was not James Bond tech. So as he's looking down, I'm wearing a blue denim jacket, traditional blue denim jacket with metal stud buttons. And he gets to the button and he looks at it and he feels the back. And there's no doubt what he's found. There's no doubt what's winking up at him is a camera, because it's a drilled hole in the middle of the button. And it's glistening. And he says, fucking hell, man, he is as well. He's fucking heat, man. He's 5'0", he's heat. And at that moment, I had that surge of adrenaline, time completely slowing down, thinking, right, I need to think my way through this. What am I going to do? And I realised that if he could communicate to his friend what he'd found, I was in trouble, because then I would lose my ally. So I thought, well, I have to stop that communication happening. So I launched into a tirade of abuse. I just started to say, what are you doing? Fucking picking at my clothes. You don't know what you're fucking on about. It's not even my coat. It's Jackie's coat. I got it from her this morning. It was hung on the back of the chair. I just put it on. It's not my fucking coat. And anyway, what are you doing picking at my fucking clothes? And this guy, who was huge, by the way, I was looking right up at him. And he's one of these guys who clearly spends almost all day lifting weights and drug dealing. Lifting weights and drug dealing. And he was really taken aback at this. He was very surprised by my reaction and was a bit shocked. Shocked to the point where you could see clearly he was starting to doubt himself. Like, whoa, oh, well, maybe I didn't find what I just found. And I just kept this abuse up while he's trying to process and work out what's going on. I kept this up thinking I've got to keep this up, because if I allow a gap, in that gap he will communicate with his mate sat in the car cutting me up some crack. So I take the jacket off him and then off the other guy, and I start folding it really slowly, because you mentioned instinct. I realised if I was to run, it would be like running away from wolves and they would follow me in a pack. So I just went really slow and I started walking really slowly away, shouting this abuse at him, insulting him and swearing at him, and keep walking and shouting a bit like a madman. And he's like, but. Anyway, I got about halfway across this car park and then I heard running feet behind me. It's one set of running feet. And I thought, oh, well, I almost got away. I thought if I spin round and punch him as hard as I can, maybe if I get one punch in, then I can sprint and see how close I can get to the exit. So I'm ready to spin round, and it was the guy I know. And he says, oh, don't mind my mate, he's a dickhead. I said, yes, he is a dickhead. And he's been picking at my clothes and it's not even my jacket. What the fuck's he doing? He says, oh, don't mind him. At this point, his mate is stood by the car, literally screaming at him now. He's saying, man, for fuck's sake, he's the heat. And he's like, no. And he says, well, don't you want this ting? I've just cut it up. And I'm thinking to myself, you seriously want to sell me some crack now? Are you joking? I thought, okay, yeah, of course I do, man, yeah. So I got the 20 quid out of my pocket and give it him. It's all perfectly framed on the camera as well, the deal. And I start walking away and he goes back to the car. And then I hear a revving engine and a squeal of the tyres. And I know it's time to move quickly now. And I'd almost got to the exit of the car park, but the car roared across the car park to me. I got at the car park, I turned left, and the car park actually opened up onto what we call the inner ring road. So it's a dual carriageway, normally quite a busy road, and there's a pavement there. So I started running along the pavement. The car came out of the car park, turned left after me, and bumped up the pavement. So it's driving down the pavement after me. I kept running, but in quite a short distance, the dual carriageway came to a roundabout. And where the roundabout is, there was a metal railing separating the road and the pavement. And I just got to that point. And as I looked over my shoulder as I got to that point, the car was no more than about 2 meters away from me. So I'd beaten it by a couple of seconds, really, a second. But I got to that point, and so the car then bumped slowly onto the roundabout and drove around the roundabout a couple of times looking at me. But from that point, I could walk towards the pedestrian area of the city. So I was fairly safe quite quickly. And I saw them going around the roundabout, and I still kept playing it up. I still kept looking down at the button and going like, what? But then I left the area and I went back to the safe location. I told the team about what happened and described the people, told them the number plate of the car. And the intel guy went out the room for a minute, came back a couple of minutes later laughing. He was laughing. He said, well, I don't know why they didn't just shoot you rather than chasing you in the car, because there's loads of intel that there's a gun in that car. And, we all pissed ourselves laughing at that. We all thought that was one of the funniest things that we'd ever heard. Funny how you respond to these things, really.
Okay, one important aspect of the work that you did undercover involved getting to know people who were just like addicted and did small-time dealing to support, to basically stay, I don't know if staying healthy is the correct word, but to avoid withdrawal. And in order to do that, you also had to learn to dress in a way that you would blend in with those people. So maybe you can talk a bit about that part.
Yeah, I mean, when I first started, again, I was learning on the fly, and I would present myself as a sort of traveling thief, dressing in a full matching tracksuit and Nike Air Max trainers, that kind of thing. And that opened certain doors, but I realized that actually the connections I needed that could introduce me further up the chain were actually the people who were really struggling, the people who were using huge amounts of drugs, people who were really problematically addicted. So I started dressing like them and hanging around with them and learning from them how to fit in, which meant that in order to do that, I had to behave as much as I could like them. But in order to do that, I had to learn their motivations and who they were, which meant that I was using my empathy to get to know them, which I now refer to as weaponizing empathy, which is quite a dark phrase, I think, but it's very fitting that I was using that connection with them against them to manipulate them. And so, yeah, I got to know all sorts of characters. And it was interesting that community of people who were homeless, living in squats, on the real fringes of society, were some of the kindest, most community-minded people you would meet, really. And I remember one young woman, Uma. I remember one day I was thinking I need to play rattling today. I need to make out that I'm rattling and coming off heroin and I haven't got any money, because I was aware that I was creating a bit of suspicion as being the guy who always had money. And so I was playing rattling, and she looked at me one day and she said, that day, it was in the morning, and she said, "Hey mate, you hanging out? You're struggling, aren't you? You're ill." And she reached in her pocket and she gave me £5. It was clearly the only money she had. I says, "Well, hang on, you need that, don't you?" She says, "No, but I've just had a hit. I'm all right for a few hours. You need it now." So that kindness actually was really common, that sort of mutual support, sense of mutual support. But I still took advantage of it.
And your encounters with these people played a big part in you starting to doubt the worth of the job that you were doing, because you were doing your job well, you were effective.
Yeah, because I mean, when I started the work, I had a very stigmatized view of people who were using heroin or crack. Very stigmatized. Very basic lack of understanding. I saw them as people who'd made a stupid mistake in trying these drugs and not having the willpower to get themselves out of it. And I just judged them for that. That's harsh, but it is a common viewpoint. But I was getting to know these people and realizing that there was a lot more to them. And also, they all had a story, all of them. They all, I mean, I know now, of course, that the academic evidence is clear that people who are using heroin and crack and other drugs problematically, it's because they're self-medicating for childhood trauma. I know that academically now, but I was learning that on the fly because I was hearing their stories, you know. These people were self-medicating for sexual abuse. And Uma, in fact, told me, she said, I can stop heroin. And I do every few weeks. I bring my tolerance down, so it makes it more affordable. But when I stopped taking heroin, I become suicidal because I remember the feeling of my uncle's fingernails when he used to sexually abuse me as a little girl. So for her, it's a very pragmatic decision to keep taking heroin because heroin's a very good painkiller of emotional pain. So for her, it really truly was medicine, and that's the same for most of them. So this was a rewiring completely of my perception. I didn't understand that before, and so I became acutely aware that I was causing these problems, these vulnerable, damaged people harm, because the worst thing that could happen to them is to meet me and get to know me, because they would end up committing offences that I was providing evidence against, and they were getting arrested, and their lives were being made even worse by me. And this was really pressing on me. But so I was in this constant conflict, that I was causing harm to these individuals, but I still kept going, and I kept doing it because I was seeing the end job. You know, after 6 or 7 months, I'd catch the nasty gangsters at the end of the job. So it would make it all worth it. Yeah. It would make all of that harm that I was causing worth it. And so I was constantly justifying my own behavior to myself, that this is worth it. This is a choice. And that's how the whole system works. The whole covert undercover system works, you know. But it seems that there was only me at that time really being really pained by it. But, you know, you look at that, it's incredible ruthlessness. And the idea that policing can cause harm to some individuals for an end result, you know, that's justified. I don't think that's ever been part of what policing is meant to be about. There's no one ever said that, you know, police are allowed to cause harm to individuals. But that's the way it was. I saw it, and that's the way it was seen. That the end justifies the means, and the end justifies the means is like, it's battlefield logic, isn't it? It's the logic of a general who sacrifices a platoon because he knows he might win the battle. But there's no place for that in civil policing. There isn't, and yet this is the ruthlessness of that's created by our current policy. And that actually, I mean, I've talked already about my chronic PTSD and some of the triggers, but like most people who have complex PTSD, it's complex. And part of my PTSD is what's referred to as moral injury. And moral injury was first identified in veterans returning from the Vietnam War, because they were profoundly guilty about the things that they'd been asked to do and the things that they'd done. And so part of my condition is moral injury as well. You know, it's a profound sense of guilt, and I get a sense of depression from that guilt, because what I was doing was contrary to my core values, and yet I was still doing it, and still doing it again, and doing it again. And you can't come through that kind of decision making and without causing emotional harm to yourself. So I discovered.
And the justification for doing that was supported by pretty much all of society.
Yeah, absolutely. This war on drugs is waged, and police are tasked in carrying it out. This is the reality of what a punitive drug policy means. This is the reality of drugs policing. This is what police are naturally tasked to do. Every day, even though it's, we're talking about undercover policing and the very intense side of drugs policing, and not every country has the kind of policing that I did. But even so, if a police officer arrests a vulnerable person who's struggling like that, you're causing them harm when they need help. It's that simple. You're causing them harm when they need help, and that's not right. The policing should be about protecting people. It should be about saving lives, reducing harm, making society safer, more secure. And this isn't doing that.
What do you think when you hear about making society more secure by increasing, it's not the way maybe it's phrased, but what actually seems to be happening is that the police is getting more and more militarized in a sense of the equipment they get, and cars that look like they could be taken from the battlefield directly in.
Yeah, I mean, it's a nightmare, isn't it? Because where does it end? It's a constant acceleration of the drug war. And the reason that autocratic or get tough politicians want the police to do more, and then the police do more, and then the police have to adapt or develop more militaristic approaches, is because since the declaration of war, this war's been escalating ever since. And actually, it's not best described as a war. It's actually an arms race. It's a perpetual arms race, because the police get more militaristic or better at what they do, and organised crime always adapts, constantly adapts. Perhaps I should tell you about the conclusion of the Burger Bar boys, what happened to them, because it emphasises the point quite well, I think. At the end of the 7 months, I'd got enough evidence against the Burger Bar boys, and I was pleased because, as I've described, I didn't enjoy their company, to say the least. And I was excited because we'd gathered evidence against the 6 main gangsters plus 90 other people, 96 people. And I knew that we'd caught everyone because there were no new names to meet. There was no phone numbers I hadn't already got. I'd got evidence against everybody. So I thought, wow, this operation is going to be much more impactful than any of them. It's going to get everyone. There was hundreds of cops brought in from counties all around, lots of different police forces. It was a massive operation. And when the dust settled, the intel officer for the operation spoke to me. It was his job to keep his ear to the ground as to the impact. And he says, yeah, we managed to interrupt the drug supply in Northampton for a full 2 hours. 7 months of work, all that, the times I thought I was going to die, all of those resources, all of those vulnerable people manipulated and damaged further for the sake of interrupting the drug supply for 2 hours. All of my doubts, really, that I've been pushing to one side came flooding to me. Now, I don't know for sure that the Burger Bar Boys' infamous rivals, the Johnson crew, was the gang that took up that opportunity that we'd created for them. But you can sort of picture the scene, can't you? The gang's all sat around, and one of them comes in and says, "Hey boys, put the call in. We're going to make a fortune. Guess what the cops have done for us? They've only gone and locked up the Burger Bar Boys. This is fantastic. Going to double our profits this weekend." And that's, of course, what we do, because the police are really good at catching drug dealers, really good at it. And if some get-tough politician tells them to catch more, gives them the resources to do it, the police will catch more drug dealers. But that's a big part of the problem, because the market never shrinks. The police never reduce the size of the market, ever. So if they're not reducing the size of it, what are they doing? Because that activity has to do something. Well, they're changing the shape of it. In this never-ending arms race, they're changing the shape of it. And that changing shape's never an improvement. So more often than not, that gap in the market creates an uptick in violence. So communities become more violent because people compete over that opportunity. There's a lot of money to be made, and they'll compete with violence. Also, often, consumption goes up, because where they don't compete with violence, they'll compete with prices. They'll come into an area and swamp it with deals. And if it's amphetamine or methamphetamine, they'll say it's always 2-for-1s. It's always 2-for-1s with speed. So you buy one get one free. For heroin, it's in the UK. It's often you buy 4 bags, you get an extra one free. So 5 for the price of 4, or sometimes even 3 for the price of 2. These deals come in, and people think, great, I can afford a bit more. So you get an increase in consumption, you get an increase in violence, but you also get an increase in corruption. And this is really important for people to understand, because where the police create these gaps in the market, the gang or kingpin character or whatever that is most able to take up that opportunity is someone who already has a big share in the market. So they expand their share of that market, which creates, over time, it creates monopolies. And if a gang of organised crime increase their market share, they increase their disposable income. And if they increase their disposable income, they will always invest it in corruption. Always. Because it's the most important part of the business model of organised crime is to corrupt the systems, corrupt the police, corrupt the criminal justice system, corrupt the prisons so we can deal in prisons, corrupt the lot. And you create those monopolies and that increases their power to do that. And there's examples around the world, very famous and obvious examples. So, for example, there used to be 20 cartels in Mexico. Now there's 3 cartels in Mexico, each with a very powerful share of a market, it has entirely corrupted Mexico. There's less than 1% chance that if a murder is committed that it'll be detected. The murderer caught in Mexico now.
Less than 1?
Less than 1%. Only 10 years ago, it was 5%. 30 or 40 years ago, it was 50%. That's a dramatic erosion of basic security in Mexico. And that's caused by the monopolization of the market. And it happens at every level. Less than 2 years ago, the National Crime Agency, which is Britain's national crime agency, they monitor international crime, or transnational organised crime, they made a strange announcement. And I say it's strange because I normally have to find these things out through my private contacts in such organisations. But they made a public announcement that for the first time, the Italian mafia is now working with British organised crime gangs. And I don't know why would they make this announcement? But they did. But it's a perfect example of the monopolisation of organised crime created by policing. Because that's now a cooperative by 2 organised crime groups which would normally be at odds with each other. But now they're a cooperative and sharing resources. And sharing those resources means they're much more able to corrupt, and they'll share corrupt resources. So transnational organised crime supply is constantly being more refined, perfected, and made much easier for those that make profits from it. And we've done this by trying to deal with drugs through policing. And drugs are the 4th biggest industry in the world. They're bigger than textiles. And it's $500 billion a year, and completely uncontrolled and untaxed.
You have one amazing story regarding how corruption manifests in police work. And this also has got to do with your instinct, so maybe you can share that.
Yes. In the Nottingham operation, it was actually the day after I had that rather uncomfortable interrogation with the knife pressed into my groin. The day after, I had a morning briefing, and 2 of my backup team had gone off sick. We'd been working very long hours. And I was introduced to 2 new cops who were brought in to replace them. Now, I was never happy about new people coming into the operation, but I met the first one, shook his hand, and I had no problem with him at all. And the second one, I shook his hand, and the hairs went up on the back of my neck. I mean, instinctively, this guy was wrong to me. Instantly didn't trust him. Now, by this point, I think I've been working undercover on that job for 4.5 months. And that means that my sensors are really fine-tuned. I was really sensitive to nuances of body language. And this guy's body language was just completely wrong. And so I went to the boss running the operation, the SIO, and said, "Look, boss, there's no way I trust this guy. I'm not happy about this at all." And he said, "It's fine. We'll exclude them both. We'll not tell them why. They've not been in the briefing. They know nothing about this job yet. They've just been told to come here. We'll send them away and they'll never know anything about it." I thought, great. So that's exactly the response I wanted. So I was happy and put it out of my mind then. 12 months later, when the gangster Colin Gunn was caught, not by my operation, but by a subsequent operation by Nottinghamshire Constabulary, the Bestwood cartel was dismantled, and it turned out that this police officer that I'd taken exception to was an employee of Colin Gunn. He was part of that gang. And he was paid to join the police. He wasn't corrupted whilst in the police. He was paid to join. And he was paid £2,000 a month on top of his police wages, plus bonuses for good information. He'd been in the police for 7 years by the time I met him. And in fact, he was sentenced to 7 years in prison by the judge. His name's Charlie Fletcher, so it's a very public knowledge. But in the debrief for that, one of the senior cops said to me, "Woodsy, we know this happens. Of course this happens. With this much money involved, how can it not happen?" And so it became clear to me really only then that it's an accepted thing for the senior covert police and senior police, not just in the UK, but everywhere, that this happens. You know, we put these systems in place when we're investigating drugs as best we can, but we know we can't stop it. That's the attitude. Now, I think that acceptance and understanding that corruption is happening and will always happen in the current regime needs to be explained to the public. It shouldn't be kept secret by police. Because again, if the public understood how drugs policing causes this corruption and the extent of that corruption, I think the public would put pressure on to change policy quite quickly. So it's important that we get this information out there.
So once again, instinct played a major role there. Just as a slight detour, what do you think instinct is?
Well, I say that I had been working for a good few months undercover and my instincts were fine-tuned, but instincts are only what we observe. They are, most of the time, we communicate a lot in body language, and most of the time, most of that reaction to body language is unconscious. But when we're in situations of greater threat, those unconscious body language reactions become much more important because we're acutely aware of our risks, danger. I learnt over time to be consciously aware of body language much more than I was before. It was a constant learning process for me to try and unpick those instincts and to bring them to my front of my brain, to consciously react to them so that I was better able to survive. So I'd gone through a long process of just trying to be more intelligently aware of my own unconscious responses to body language and people's behaviour. So we say instinct, but it's really what we see and hear, or even smell, that a lot of our conscious thought is taken up with what's in front of us. Our subconscious mind, our peripheral thinking, is also aware of these unconscious cues. So I think it's merely the brain doing its thing. And if we were aware of everything that our brain was doing at once, it would make for very crowded thinking, which of course can be the path to certain types of mental health difficulties. Or some people have neurodiversity where they are much more aware of what their brain is thinking all at once. So instinct is an interesting word, isn't it? I think, because our brains are amazing. They're incredible what they can pick up, and how they respond differently to different situations.
So, as the process went on, of you slowly starting to realize the morally problematic aspects of your work. You already referred to some of the people that you met who exhibited kindness that made you reevaluate your previous conceptions of those people. There was also, was it Cami was the name that you used in the book? So your encounters with him were very touching.
Yeah, I mean, Cami was again. It's the Nottingham operation again, and Cami was the person who actually introduced me to the guy in the car with his 12-year-old son. And so Cami was the vulnerable person that I'd picked out really as my person I was going to manipulate, because he was so useful to me, because he was on bail for dealing heroin. And so he was on the very periphery of the gang that I was most interested in. So he had those connections. So I spent loads of time getting to know him. I spent time. He was good fun actually. He was a good guy to hang around with. You know, he had a good observational wit. And I went shoplifting with him, which was good fun. And I got to know him pretty well. And you know, I'd listened to his stories about. Well, when I dug a bit, it was clear that he was self-medicating because of his relationship with his father. And I'll never forget him saying, "Yeah, my dad used to hit me, but only when I deserved it." Which is an awful thing to think, really, that he internalized his sort of that he still felt that he was in the wrong. Genuinely felt that he was in the wrong for the things that he did as a child because he was beaten for them. But I got to know him and I manipulated him and I got him to introduce me to people. But eventually, of course, the operation came to an end and he was also arrested. And he was committing offences on bail when he was with me, and he was on bail for dealing. So he actually ended up getting eventually 3.5 years in prison. But when he was in the police cells, when he was in the police station, still under arrest, before he was charged, he ended up being on minute-to-minute watch, suicide watch in his police cell. And the reason for that is because he'd become suicidal. And as he explained to the interviewing officers, that he thought I was his one friend in the world, that he'd never been able to speak to anyone that well. He'd never been able to talk to anyone. He never had a friend like that. And so for that, in a traumatic, in his emotional pain, that was the last straw for him. It was that broke the camel's back and made him suicidal. So that was the thing that made me give up undercover policing for a while, because it was a huge blow. I remember hearing that. I was told that on the phone, and why the intel guy told me that, God knows. I'm glad I do know, but even so, it was a strange thing to say. And it hit me like a ton of bricks. It was emotionally really difficult.
This sort of emphasizes how complex humans are, in the sense that you were genuinely manipulating and taking advantage of this person, and at the same time I cannot avoid the impression that you also had genuine care already at that point, and that the part where he felt that you were his only friend and only one he could talk to was not fake, even though your intentions were not honest with him, but that you probably it sounds to me like that you had an actual human connection, and that's what you made use of in your work.
Yeah, exactly.
And this is such a good example of how many layers in human interaction there can simultaneously be. And for example, how people who love each other can be abusive towards each other and all kinds of.
Yeah, that's an interesting comparison, actually. Yeah, it's true. There are many layers, but from my point of view, I was being ruthless.
Yeah.
It was a ruthlessness which is actually systematic, and systematic, but played out in what should have been a normal human bonding relationship. And that's why I refer to it as weaponizing empathy. That ruthlessness is. I can't think of. There's no other situation where the arm of the government does that to a citizen. And that's the way we need to see that. That's the government doing that to its citizens. It's mind-bogglingly ruthless. And that aspect of the war on drugs, I think, will be looked back upon as, genuinely horrific, and looked back at, by civilized thinkers as how could we have done that? How could we do that to people?
So we know that there's a lot of intelligent people who, for example, have heard your arguments, have heard the kinds of stories that you're telling, who know about these problems and still disagree with you. Can you get into their perspective? What might be ways that those people uphold their view that we just need to keep going on with the drug war?
I would actually say that it's rare for, if I get an audience and I can talk about the real details of the things that we've gone into, even people who started from the opposite side are brought over to realize that it's not as simple as they thought it was. So actually, and it's not just me talking about these things, I'm part of a wider movement. We have many speakers in LEAP around the world. We find that even the tough nuts to crack, even people who are absolutely convinced that we just need to get tougher, if we have the time and the platform, we win those people over. We really do. So it's important. So thank you for this. Thank you for doing this interview, and thank you for getting this out there. But it's important for anyone listening that, we need the help to have the platforms. We need to keep growing this movement because that's how we win. However, to come to your question, I take your point, and there are still going to be ideologues, autocratic politicians, some in some countries more than others, where they still remain convinced that we just have to get tougher. We just have to give the police more resources. In fact, I heard a politician yesterday say that we just have to give the police more resources. We have to look after but they couple it with we have to look after the people who are addicted and help them not be on drugs. And we have to give the police more resources. And despite explaining that giving the police more resources is actually making these things worse, it's causing the problems, and they still remain they still believe in the ideology. It's a belief system. It's like a religion. It's very difficult to get past a belief system.
It's part of your identity also.
Yeah, and part of your identity. Yeah, part of your identity. If you believe it, you don't want to be challenged by the evidence because it fits into a broader idea of where your philosophy is, your beliefs about other things as well. So it's really, really difficult. And I can understand where they come from. They come from a position of fear. They come from a position of long-term propaganda, misinformation. They've been told, they've grown up with parents who've told them that drugs are a moral evil. And, moral judgment really is the big problem here. And the way that moral judgment is wound up with some people's political ideologies or strong sense of religious righteousness or whatever it is. It's moral judgment which has got us into this problem. And we need to suspend moral judgment and think and just follow the evidence. We have to follow the evidence. But I remain hopeful because if we can keep expanding the movement, if we can find the platforms and keep finding the support from such wonderful people as we have here in Finland, we have great allies here, some really intelligent, brilliant people working on these things. If we can keep finding the platform and expanding, we can win because most politicians can actually be won over. Most of them can. And the thing that wins most of them over is the fact that they follow public opinion. So this political movement is more about changing the opinion of the public and informing the public than it is advocating to politicians, because politicians will follow. And this is happening, of course. We have legal regulated cannabis markets coming. We have one coming in Germany, and that is going to be a big game changer because it's the biggest economy in Europe. That is going to be a domino effect. It will follow around the rest of Europe. We have the legal status of psychedelics starting to change. in of all places, Australia. I mean, I didn't see that coming. I mean, I know there's been some fantastic things done by Mind Medicine Australia and some other brilliant activists, but the Australian government legalising therapeutic use of psilocybin and MDMA, that's amazing. I mean, that's incredible. I mean, I know that's not legal access for adults yet, but it's a change in the legal status of it, and it's a change in the way those drugs are viewed, both by the public and the politicians. It's a very significant moment, I think. And Joe Biden bringing a task force, creating a task force to fast track the development of therapeutic use of psychedelics. And they've got a 2-year mandate to do that. Again, that's incredible. So times are changing, but it is public opinion that's driven those things. Public opinion, it's the work of activists, hardworking people that's changed public opinion. There are some notable examples where it has been political leadership rather than the growth of the movement which has brought it. It's generally the growth of the movement. But the notable examples are, of course, the wonderful Ruth Dreyfus in Switzerland. When she was health minister, she, in 1994, successfully brought in a policy of heroin prescribing in Switzerland. And she had to show leadership. She had to completely win over the population for that. So that was leadership-led. But that's rare. Justin Trudeau in Canada, he decided to actually lead on cannabis legal regulation as one of his 3 main campaigning issues, which meant that he won the election in 2015, I think. He won on that mandate, and he had to show leadership, and he had to win over the population to win that. So there are examples of political leadership.
What do you think when you hear people saying that the legalization of cannabis has actually, like, the effects that it's had up until now have been somewhat of a disappointment?
That's the voice of the opposition. You know, change is going to come slowly. We're not going to perfect it overnight. I mean, and we have to learn from the mistakes that other countries made, because legal cannabis is coming. So let's get it right. Let's learn what the mistakes are. And the mistakes in Canada are pretty obvious. First, well, no, there's a few mistakes. First of all, it looks corrupt to many of us because, funnily enough, the big companies that got a license to do it are signed up members of the Liberal Party. The price is twice the illicit market price, twice the price, which is pretty stupid, because if your aim is to get rid of the illicit market, you've got to use pricing as a mechanism. So they've only got rid of 60%. 60% is legal market in Canada at the moment. But it's still a victory, because that's a lot of money not going into the hands of organised crime. They have reduced underage consumption. Even with 60% of control, they've still protected children better. So it is still a success, but they've got a lot to do. And another mistake they made is they didn't tap into the knowledge of the illicit market. So their quality, the legal product, isn't as good for those people whose quality matters. It's not as good as what they can still buy illicitly. So these are mistakes that we can learn on. But most importantly, we need to learn from the mistakes of some of the states in America, because when we do take legal control of cannabis, it has to be done with social equity. We can't just surrender to the free market. We have to look after those communities which have been most marginalised by drug prohibition. So we need to invest in communities of colour. We need to, like they do in New York State, very successfully, they have grants for startup businesses. They're quashing, in some states, they're quashing convictions, very important. They're investing in people who have suffered. So there's examples of how we're not to do it, like California. God, no. And there are examples of how to do it successfully. So, you know, I'm here in Finland, and I see Finland as being the natural leaders in this. Natural leaders, because you've got such a great reputation for social policy. Every country in Europe's trying to copy your housing first policy. You've got the best alcohol regulation in Europe, and you do it so successfully. You have significantly less alcohol deaths than the UK per capita, significantly less. So there's various reasons why Finland should be a natural leader in this, and we need leadership because we want it done right.
I find myself thinking about how the ex-Prime Minister of the UK, David Cameron, used to be against prohibition, very critical of prohibition, and then until he was not. And
Yeah,
this,
yeah. Amazing how people change their opinion for political power, isn't it, really? It's in 2003 he was part of a committee which declared prohibition an absolute failure. So, yeah. But times are changing, and it is becoming easier for politicians to take a principled and evidence view of drug policy. It is. It is easier now than then.
what do you think about, or would you comment about, because the people who are bearing the main burden of the drug war are people who are, in general, in the lowest rungs of the ladders of society. They are people who are already the worst off, and they might be people who, for some minor drug offenses, for example, get sentences. Not in Finland, actually, because people don't get prison sentences from small, like, personal possession stuff. Or even though we do have that, the Finnish law permits prison sentences for even small drug offenses, because that enables search warrants for homes, but they don't actually, they're not sentenced by that. But yeah, I digress. The point being that people who in the UK, for example, who are minor offenders, drug offenders, get sentences that are comparable to people who are violent gang criminals. And maybe you can comment a bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, of course, it's the people of the lowest economic positions which are affected most. But most importantly, to note with this is that actually the war on drugs has always been about racism. Always, it's been. Our international drug laws are essentially American domestic racism exported around the world through aggressive foreign policy. That's what our international drug control mechanism is. It's American domestic racism. And that plays out because it's in the DNA of the policy. So in the UK, if you're black, you're 9 times more likely to be stop searched for drugs than if you're white. 9 times more likely. Now that's an extraordinary figure. But then when you consider that if you are caught with drugs, then if you're black, you're more likely to be charged than cautioned if you're white. And then if you are looking at prison, you're more likely to be sent to prison than not, and you're more likely to get a longer sentence than the white person does. Now, I was never very good at maths at school, but even I know that that's geometric. That's a multiplier, and that multiplier is racism, and that's how it plays out.
And regardless of ethnicity, people use about the same amount of drugs.
Exactly, and the evidence is very clear on that it doesn't make it. Yeah, black people are not using more drugs than white people.
What do you think about when you hear or when you've heard about Prince Harry openly talking about his therapeutic experiences with ayahuasca and psilocybin mushrooms? And
it's interesting that because there's a debate amongst reformers at the moment. I read something yesterday that some allies suggesting that it's not been helpful. I completely disagree. That any discussion from a prominent public figure about doing this, whatever your views are about the palatability of that person or the divisive nature of that person, any conversation about it in the public domain is helping to normalize those activities, because it's activities that some people don't even hear about at all and have no understanding of, but now they do. Lots of people who pay attention to Prince Harry now know that there is something called ayahuasca that people sometimes take, and it helps them with their mental health. The way that it's treated in the media may well shape people's opinions on that, but it's still out there and it's still being normalized. And, we're on a steady journey to the public accepting that drug use is normal. And I only see it as helpful. I do. And it's interesting because it's not just his experience. We have allies in organizations like Heroic Hearts, Heroic Hearts is a charity in the US and the UK that sends veterans away to ayahuasca retreats to treat them for PTSD, and it's very successful. And we need their stories out there. We need people to understand that these are medicines that have been suppressed. That there is an opportunity here for society to be more well if we allow people's personal autonomy to take these treatments.
Yeah, I tend to disagree. I tend to agree with how you approach the Prince Harry case, because I think in the psychedelic, sort of like pro-psychedelic communities, there tends to be quite a lot of gravitation towards only accepting like perfect poster boys or girls to talk about the issue, whether it's like that people who are just like for example, people who may have had like their mental problems worsened by the use of psychedelics, that they should not talk about psychedelics because they will paint the wrong picture, or that elite people who are then once again like repeating the story of rich white people being able to get away with stuff that other people are not. And I think that's an important discussion to have, and that's an important criticism to put out. And at the same time, I think it's also a reality that many kinds of people from many kinds of or many areas of society use both psychedelics and drugs in general. And I think we need more honest discussions on the very complex realities that are involved in that. And but I actually, because we're starting to run out of time, so I don't want to go too far into that. Just quickly, if you can say a bit about your eventual decision to leave your work as a cop, and also how you decided to become public with all of this.
Yeah, I mean, I did an operation. I carried on working after the Northampton job, and I did an operation in Brighton where I was hearing from some of the vulnerable people on the streets, and a situation had happened there where they'd overused the tactic, and the organised crime gangs, and there was gangs from London, Liverpool, and Birmingham all servicing Brighton. It was a very busy drug market, and those gangs were using homeless people as proxy dealers. So they were using them as points of contact. They would say, right, you're going to bring the money from everyone, and you're going to be the only person who comes, and if you bring anyone else near us, we're going to kill you. And this was the sort of what was being talked about. This is before children were more routinely used in that role, and it was homeless people at that time. Now we have 50,000 children in the UK dealing heroin and crack. Thank you, Prohibition. But at that time, it was homeless people, and some of them, they were dying. And at that time, Brighton had the highest drug deaths per capita in the UK by a long way. They were dropping like flies. People I was getting to know, the next day they were dead. And I can't say for certain that there was any murders happening. However, some people were talking about that, these were casual murders by organised crime to keep us in line. They were given an extra dose. Now, I can't say that was happening or not, because that would take an entire a full police investigation to find out if that was true. But the response of my colleagues, now, whereas I'd always worked with very professional cops, these in Brighton were awful. I mean, they were horrible individuals. They were real bullying. It was a real bullying atmosphere, and they'd even try and bully me in the briefings. It was just an uncomfortable thing. And I was in this situation where the people I was spending time with in the streets, who were quite likable and interesting people, and I was going back to the debrief and actually really not liking the cops I was working with. And this, I just had to walk away from it. I walked away and gave up undercover work. And then I thought, I have to do something. I was fired up with this idea that I had to do something. And I thought, well, I need to change the police culture. So I tried to change things from the inside. I got promoted to detective sergeant, and was trying to change things, just to work out how I could change the system. And of course, I was on the road to nowhere, because there's no way I could change a whole drug policy and the way that police deal with drugs from a position of a detective sergeant. Is a ludicrous idea. And I think I've been probably beginning to be ill from the Northampton job onwards, and I just descended into mental illness. I was really quite. It was gradual, and I didn't understand what was happening. I went off sick, and I was under this huge pressure to do something. Thinking about all those people that died, all those people who were vulnerable. And I thought, well, I can't do it in the police. And of course, as soon as I decided I was going to resign, a big pressure left me. And I decided I had to get myself better so that I could do something outside the police and use my voice outside. And since I took that decision, then that was the path, that was the road to feeling better. But it took me a long time to be able to feel confident to actually speak out publicly. I had some work to do on myself, really. But then I actually spoke to an organisation called Release, who I'd always followed and read their publications in the police. Release are an amazing organisation in the UK. And I used to read all of Transform Drug Policy Foundation's work as well. So I got in touch with Release, and they put me in touch with Leap, which I hadn't heard of because they were quite small in the UK. And I met Jason Reed, the brilliant Jason Reed, who leads Leap UK and does the Stop and Search podcast. And I've been working with him ever since. And I've got to know, and I've become part of the board of Leap in the USA, and I work with the Americans, and as part of a growing team of brilliant allies and volunteers, we are growing Leap across Europe.
And you've said that in the UK it's actually police who are carrying quite a bit of weight of advancing the reform movement.
Yeah, because politics is really stuck in an autocratic mess in the UK at the moment. You might have noticed the UK is a political mess and has been for a few years. From observers looking in, wherever I travel in Europe, people smile wryly like you just did and like, yeah, the UK looks a mess. Well, believe me, from our point of view, it's actually much worse than you think. Our politics is nowhere. And a few years ago, we had even 3 years ago, even 18 months ago, we had many, many allies, many MPs who were speaking out regularly and helping us. At the moment, everyone's being quiet. None of our allies are speaking out because the broader politics, there's such big stakes in the politics, the broader politics, so that there's no room to talk about it at the moment. But since 2015-16, it has been and still is the police which are leading drug law reform in the UK. They're way ahead of the politics. We've got drug diversion schemes, which are essentially de facto decriminalisation. And there's one in the Thames Valley that's a diversion scheme that's pre-arrest. So someone isn't even arrested. They're just given an appointment to see a drug treatment service provider. There's no arrest involved. There's no criminal sanction at all. And so these are the kind of innovations that are happening. Not everywhere. Some police forces are still completely nuts and still, trying to fight the drug war the old-fashioned way. But there's so much reform thinking, and it's being led by the cops, by really clever police thinkers.
Because they've witnessed the effects of the drug war.
Exactly, and the futility and the waste of it. And there's some really good people in the police in the UK who are leading this. And this is in spite of the politics. This is where politics has taken an autocratic, nightmarish step. The cops are leading the way in the UK, and we've got lots of quiet, very good allies in the UK, and it goes to show that the police can change things because politics is having to catch up. Politicians are having to actually bring in diversion schemes into policy. Wouldn't have happened without police leading it. So police can do this, and they can do it anywhere.
So quite a bit has changed since you came out with your book and started giving interviews on this topic, and you've said that you were declared public enemy number one, and your previous colleagues were forbidden from being in contact with you. Yeah.
I got a good friend of mine in the job was given a lawful order, and she was told to delete me from her social media and her phone there and then. And that was she was to have no further contact with me at all. Yeah, that's what they did in 2015, I think, just before the book came out. I did an interview for Vice, I think it was. And Yeah, I was absolutely public enemy number one because I was seen to be betraying secrets. You know, I was talking about undercover work, which is meant to be secret, and I was giving the tactics out, which is ludicrous, as if it's this great fantasy that organised crime don't know exactly what's out there already. You know, it's so daft. But yeah, it was harsh. It was hard. I got hate mail from people, but very quickly, you know, by the end of 2017, you know, a year or so after the book came out, I've had no negative contact from cops at all. I've only had encouragement. I've only had support, congratulations, warm words. You know, I've obviously been invited to, like I said, the University of Law not long ago, which trains cops. There's loads of student police, criminology places. Increasingly, I'm talking more and more to the police. It's changed dramatically, actually, since 2015. Really dramatically.
That's really fascinating, and it would be amazing to be able to go on for 2 or 3 hours more to hear your stories and your thinking. But maybe we'll do episode 2 sometime in the future. But I have 5 short final questions that I present to all of my guests, so you can answer with 1 sentence or more. And the first one of them is an early memory that has affected the course of your life.
God, early memory that's affected the course of my life. That's a real difficult one. Ask me the next one. It'll be percolating at the back of my brain.
Okay, something that inspires you.
Something that inspires me. It's a bit more of a complex answer to this because what inspires me has changed. And I've been reflecting on this recently that as a boy, I used to be really into historical fiction, particularly quite militaristic stuff, like the books by the author Hornblower or Patrick O'Brien. It was about the Napoleonic Wars, seafaring stuff, and officers who had a sense of honour, a sense of duty. And that sense of honour and duty sort of did infect my approach to policing and influence my thinking then. Nowadays, the last few years, I've found myself, as I read and study other activists, you know, activists that changed the right to abortion or activists that fought for the ending of illegality of homosexuality or gender equality, whoever it is, my heroes have become activists. And so now the people who inspire me are the activists that I most admire. And I think I don't necessarily agree with all their politics, but I admire them a great deal. And there's 2 particular. One is Peter Tatchell, who is a gay rights activist in the UK. And he's been assaulted, something like over 300. He's been attacked for his views over 300 times. He ran to be member of parliament, and he was attacked in the street while he was trying to campaign, and he still kept going. So I admire that man a great deal, and I also admire Angela Davis of the Black Panthers, and because I love what she writes, and one of my favourite quotes is by her, that in a racist society, it is not enough to be not racist. You have to be anti-racist. It's a simple statement, but I think it's worth living by.
Okay, shall we go back to the first, or do I ask the third one first?
No, keep going.
Okay, something that you're afraid of.
Something that I'm afraid of. Again, that's quite difficult. Something that I'm afraid of. I suppose it's what I'm afraid of is what any parent is afraid of, the harm coming to your children. I mean, my children they're not children anymore. 20, yeah, Tanith's almost 26, so 26 and 24. And they have their ups and downs and strife, and it's, you know, as you never stop being a parent, and you never stop really worrying about what you know, what's happening with them, and you just want them to be happy and safe. So that's the fear, I suppose.
Mm. If things go well, what kind of direction will you be heading towards?
If things go well,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, some friends and some comrades tell me I need to switch off more, and I'm trying to learn that because I only see a future of activism. I don't see an end point. In fact, Carl Hart said to me, he says you've got to give yourself a time limit. He says I've set myself so many years, and on this point I'm going to stop, and that's when I'm going to retire. And no matter what I've achieved, he says you need to do the same. And I find that really hard to think because the job's never going to be done. So maybe my future is carrying on till I'm burnt out and can't do it anymore. Looking at it in a grim fashion. But we are getting some success. We are getting some more opportunities, and if we need people to help us with funding, and if we find more funding, then we can be more successful. So I see the movement is growing. I see more successes. I always stay optimistic because I have to, otherwise I think I would go mad. So I see potential successes. And me personally, I've got some new work to do because it looks like, fingers crossed, a drama development of Good Cop, Bad War is actually in development. The deal's signed and it's in development. Now, lots of things can go wrong with TV, of course. But it's actually in development. So that could change things a bit as well and bring, it could highlight the cause much better, and the movement can make good use of that.
That's very interesting to hear. Okay, now back to the first question. Any early memory that affected the course of your life?
I have a very early memory. I used to be very reckless, and I would be the one climbing a rope, climbing a tree, or falling out of a tree. And as a young kid, where I grew up in the town of New Mills in North Derbyshire, which is quite near to the Manchester border, there was a woodland behind our house, and there was a brilliant rope swing that someone had climbed up and this slope, and the rope swing went right over a massive pond, almost a lake. It was great. Anyway, I was having a go on this, and the one time I went on it, I fell. And I fell into the middle of a load of nettles. So when you're in the middle of it, there's no way out other than through more nettles. And so I had to wade through these nettles. And I went home, and I was like shaking and crying, and I was like covered in nettle stings. And I was screaming, crying, "Mom!" And my mother just asked me, "Is that helping?" And I had to think. Actually, no, it's not. And so, yeah, I think that influenced my development.
Wonderful. So, okay, I encourage all the listeners to follow your work. You're on Twitter, Leap, and its several branches are also on Twitter, and Leap has a web page that you can Google. I encourage people to read your books; they're amazing. And as a final, I don't know if this is a question or whatever, but you can give your greetings or suggestion or wish or command or prayer or whatever to humans.
My wish for say that again.
Yeah, you can just send out a wish or a suggestion or commandment or prayer or whatever to humans.
Do what you can, or support those that can. We can all be active in one way or another, even if it's just spreading the word, and just support people doing good things if you can.
I'm really grateful for the time you put into this. Thank you.
Thank you very good, and it's good to see you again.
Yeah,
so
likewise. Thank you for listening to my conversation with Neil Woods. I hope you were left uneasy yet inspired. Please consider supporting my work. Be well.